Yeah, thanks very much for that really wonderful intro. I am gonna unfortunately retrod some of that. But yeah, my name is Mary Yovina. I use they them pronouns. Yeah, I've been a UI artist for 10 of the almost 15 years I've been in games. And I would like to go over what UI and UX are and how you can apply design principles that are foundational to both to solve problems in your game. And I guess it didn't want to next, but I will. Yeah, there we go. Okay. So yep, I'm currently a senior UI artist at Obsidian. I've worked at Harmonix, where I was a UI art lead on Fuser, Dance Central, and Rock Band. I was also briefly an art lead on Fuser for a time. I was also a UI artist on Bioshock Infinite and Lord of the Rings Online, and then a bunch of indie games before that. I uh, I am mostly a technical UI artist, so I'm coming from that perspective of somebody who does make the stylistic choices, but also am comfortable with implementation in engines. So that's the sort of reference that you're going to have for what I'm going to talk about. And I often work on small teams, so I've done some UX design work, but that's not primarily what I do. So yeah, I will be focusing much more on working on the style implementation, and because I was a lead, I also can talk about the management side of things, but can't quite speak to the in-depth UX things. So I'll just sort of go over that a little bit. So what is UI and UX? Broadly, it's about designing interfaces and it's about building for usability. But from the perspective of problem solving, I would say it's a user-centric discipline focused on communicating information about an interactive medium through structure, consistency, contrast, and hierarchy. So what does that mean? Well, it means that everything that you do is in the context of communication, focused on addressing the player's needs, which is why it's user-centric. Players need to understand what is interactive, how to interact with it, what actions they have available to them as a user and as a player character, what's important to focus on immediately versus something that they can react to whenever they feel like it, what's required versus something that they can opt never to engage with. Uh, and so, even when designing the visuals with the goal of looking good and appropriate in the context of the rest of the game, you're also focused on how you're assigning meaning and priority through artistic choices. Depending on the size of the team and the maturity of UI and UX as a discipline at the studio, there's some common role divisions with a lot of overlap in their responsibilities. Often teams need a UX designer, a UI artist, and a UI engineer, and usually more than one of each, but you might not have that. And you might also have roles divided between people or people with one title but multiple roles responsibilities. UX designers generally focus on the usability, clarity, and structure of the experience from a design perspective, and UI artists focus on the visual language and identity as a form of communication, and UI engineers focus on ensuring the interfaces are functional and performant. And again, responsibilities overlap, and these divisions are much more fluid in practice. These are pretty rigid, but because there are three columns, and I had to. Uh, there are also collective responsibilities like building for accessibility that all three and beyond this group of people will tackle together. Additionally, there's user researchers who are important to the success of the UI, but I didn't really have the space for talking about it, and I'm not really as familiar because they tend not to, in my experience, be embedded in the teams. They're usually people who are at the request of other teams working on problems that are uh, collecting data, researching, testing the usability of interface designs across multiple teams. And again, I'm going to be focusing on problem solving as a UI artist mostly. So the questions I'm there to answer as a UI artist are, how do I incorporate the overall visual style of the game to create a UI that enhances and reinforces the rest of the look and feel of the game? And how do I set expectations in the presentation of the UI to inform players and guide player gaze? Solving UI problems requires thinking about both how the visual identity and narrative of the game is reflected in the UI and also how my choices are communicating meaning. And these two questions should not be separated. You should be tackling those things together as one cohesive problem. And as far as the process of creating interfaces is concerned, there's a general order of development and a general order of making UI art that take place over the pre-production, production, and polish phases. Sometimes these are competing for your time, but often they're serving each other. The development of features is often the proving grounds for artistic ideas because they're concrete instances of player needs being served or not. So the UI art development portion is usually follows from general research into the reference and inspiration and collecting those things and putting those things into a style guide, generating a grid, which is helpful for making sure that placement of your UI is consistent, is easy to follow and understand, and then using those reference to generate mock-ups and visual targets and things like that to develop your style guide into something that everybody on the team can look at and comprehend the overall intent of the UI, then taking all of that work and applying it uh, to functional in-game screens, then iterating on that and refining it. And so polishing, adding FX, adding animations. And then the feature development pipeline is much more outside of the UI UX team. This is where it all sort of comes together. There's much more intersecting with design and with engineering. It starts with design, where design has a spec, which is a bunch of feature needs, taking that and making a wireframe out of it. Sometimes you'll have user stories, sometimes you'll have, more written out information. Sometimes people like to draw things or sketch it. Um, Taking that, discussing with design how that layout would sort of be standardized across the UI and work with the style and the work that has already gone into the UI. Take that and then it's a gray box is what's often called. It's not really arted or not at all arted. Then taking that when it's approved and going to a mock-up phase, where then the style and the visuals come into play. Um, Sometimes simultaneously, sometimes after the implementation process begins. That's the process of getting it into the engine. And then there's an art pass, so the functional version of the screen will then get stylized. Then it will go through a polish phase, and then you'll ship. Developing the visual identity begins with gathering reference and reviewing inspiration sources and the existing art style guide. So here, this is me sort of taking folks through the Dance Central process. As you can see, Dance Central was not the first. This is Dance Central for Rift Quest and Rift S, so it was the VR iteration of this game. So there were several Dance Centrals that came before it, and so those were obviously very important inspiration for the next iteration of the game. So looking through documentation about lore and narrative and past games is highly important in this part of the process. Also considering who your audience is and who you want to attract. Maybe they're not familiar with your IP, or if you're trying to bring in new players, that can impact how you decide how to style the game. Um, and if it is something that you want to reference, then what is immediately identifiable as referential that you want to include, and how do you want or need to be new? And then from there, I take all that inspiration and I make a mock-up or two that defines the visual style and the grid at the same time. I will do both at once because they serve each other. Looking and seeing how far apart things need to be spaced, you're more considering uh, the distance between items on screen to show relationships, to define areas that are important for their own specific purposes. So you can see how there's a notification area. There's also the apps at the bottom that are the commonly needed actions that you need to take. And those designated areas needed to be determined over time of just looking through the actual uses of these screens. And so those mockups needed to exist in order for there to really be a grid that was usable. Um, and yeah, it's the grid is very important to help set up those expectations about where to look for information, visual priority, and relationships. That's very helpful for consistency. Um, and then once that work is done and it's ready to be implemented, then this is where the screens get built, prototyped, then they get the application of that art. One thing that's important to remember is the iteration and refine step is really crucial. And yes, it means revisiting the visual target, and it does mean updating the style guide and sometimes the grid, but the style guide is a living document. Things created early to prove out concepts are often done with incomplete designs, uncertainty about stylistic choices. They're sometimes done quickly, and also things tend to look different in engine. You might find out your spacing wasn't generous enough, your text wasn't bold enough, your values are too dark, and it's important to change your style guide with how it's actually being reflected in game. No one's playing
Mary,
your
can
game.
I interrupt with a sorry,
Yeah,
can I interrupt with a short question? What is a
absolutely.
visual target?
Oh, sure. So a visual target is you are trying to um I guess it's a bar to hit is like what it ultimately is. So you have specific things that you want to achieve visually with the game, and so you have aspirations for how you want that to look, and you want to be able to prove out that you can actually meet those goals, and it's not aspirational to the point that you can't achieve it. So you need to be able to prove out that you can do that, and that is now what all of your screens need to be standard wise, so that is the thing to look at to say that's what's shippable. And so when it's not hitting that, you can be able to point to something and say it's not as good as what we laid out for the goal.
It sounds like it's the part of the style guide that shows an example that everybody's trying to emulate.
Yes, yes. But that is also something that is, I would say it's in the style guide, but it's also something that is demonstrable in engine. So when it's actually in the game, and that is something that you can play, then that's the sort of end goal, like end result of that visual target. Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah, no problem. Um, let's see. So I was also, yeah, yeah. So yes, it's important to be able to change your style guide as you need to because no one's playing your game in Photoshop and your first take isn't precious. So you need to make sure that it actually looks good in engine and is proven out. Similarly, developing for features goes through a process of defining its success in stages. It first requires a design spec from a designer, and then that is documentation about some feature, or it could be a series of screens, like an in-game store, or an element that exists across the shell, like a player profile, or a multiplayer mode, or whatever it might be. There's certain requirements in that design about information the player needs to know, and there might be user stories, like I said, but there's often detailed information about why players might want to engage with that feature and what they're there to do. I can't show spec, and I can't show the whiteboarding and kickoff meeting notes, which is where people gather and talk about that stuff, to make sure that everybody's on the same page and understand the work that's involved and who is doing it. But after meeting with design to ask questions, then this is an example of a wireframe being that I go off and I do this wireframe, and you can see how the black and white gray box version of it is on the grid, and how it meets those it meets those expectations about the grid and the organization rules that we had all previously decided upon. In this particular case, even though it gray box, you'd think it's all black and white and gray, but in this particular case, it was also important to show off specifically this rainbow effect because one of the things that we needed to do was to highlight the players uh, doing well and 2 degrees of doing well and hitting level cap and going beyond level cap and continuing to level up or to earn diamonds beyond level 50. And that's the in-game currency for Fuser. Um, so uh, that is what I then take and implement in engine once it's all cleared and everybody's approved it. And then the polish and implementation and polish pass is what you'll see on the right there, which is where the layout is changed. So there's a re-layout, as well as some other artistic flair that went into celebrating the players' accomplishments as their stats go up, and they do very well. So there's additional lighting and FX work that went into that screen, and that was not something that can be proven out specifically in a wireframe, but it was something that people did go off and do some concepts that were in engine for lighting and FX. So those things were also presentable in their own way. I also want to specifically call out that although there's exceptions like establishing a visual target, or once there's a solid understanding of the UI art direction, or once there's an existing library of skinned widgets to use, which is, the arted widgets, um, it's important to implement a functional version before implementing a fully skinned version. This allows the team to judge and modify the functional aspects of the feature without having to worry about breaking the appearance of the menu or sinking a bunch of time into the art that'll get thrown out. Um, and that order matters not just for saving UI artist time, but making layouts less precious. So it's making sure that regardless of what the appearance is, people like interacting with the UI before you move on, and it feels good to use and it's clear, and that people are happy with it from a functional perspective before moving on. And on Dance Central, this was really critical. This is the in-game phone, which is our primary UI for Dance Central for Rift Quest and Rift S. This was really important for this project, to start first with the prototype and the functional version first, because we had so much work to do to tune interaction and make sure that the cell phone was comfortable to use and responsive, which would have been harder to do initially if we had to delay getting screens in the game and in front of people to get art in. That would be a delay that would be too difficult for people to get quickly moving through doing the work to make it functionally good. So how do I actually apply UI principles in the context of this process to solve a problem? I'm going to do an analysis of one screen from pre-production through polish, and that's the campaign mission select screen for Fuser. And the problem that I needed to solve was, how do we present a mission select screen for a game about being a DJ at a music festival? For people who don't know what Fuser is, it is a music mashup mixing game. It was a multi-platform game on Xbox, PC, PS4, Switch. I think I've got them all. Switch and Switch Lite. um, and the idea behind the art for Fuser was that it's a festival atmosphere, uh, very different styles. It's not any one particular style. It's festival culture, festivals in general, from kind of darker to more like colorful and bright, um, which can be, that wide range could be daunting. And then also the concept of music mixing and vibrancy and those things were incredibly important stylistic to this game. So, unfortunately, I can't really talk too much about the next step, so with images, so I will go more vaguely into detail. The mission select screen was actually part of the VizDev work for Fuser, where we first applied the visual direction we wanted to a screen in the game, but I can't show that, so uh, it looked like a rougher version of the ideas you'll see in the next slide. But what we did get out of that stage of the process is it was a much looser application of style. It wasn't on a grid. It was just aspirational, what could we do here? And again, I can't talk super in depth about the design spec, but I will say, because you can see these points represented in the final product, that we needed a way to access individual missions organized by stage. Those missions needed to have rewards, some indication of whether or not they're open to you to play, and show you how well you performed if you did play that mission. And it was also important to be able to access a persistent menu to modify settings, to get to your profile, and to read notifications. So then I move on to the mockup phase. This is where I start working on how the visual identity and also how specifically this feature can come together to become a full screen. So from the perspective of solving problems of visual identity, I needed to incorporate, festival culture, bright, vibrant, lots of, what is the concept of mashing music together. So in this, you can see they're very sketchy, but behind the UI is the festival grounds, and it's keeping players physically present in the festival location, even though they are in menus. Um, Missions are represented as festival posters with a schedule for performance, so you can see yourself getting more coveted time slots as you improve your skills. And so, because we wanted to incorporate those festival posters, and also just the idea of performing in a physical location at particular times, this was sort of the way to sort of mix those things together. And here I'm using the grid to establish rules about how content should be spaced to show relationships, and the size of elements to give priority to the main content on the screen. So as you can see, there's the main festival poster area is much more bold than everything else on the screen. Everything else is very tangential to what you need to do as your primary action on this screen. You can, if you need to go handle your the appearance of your character, you can go do that, but it is an exit that is not directly the main thing that you are here to do. Here's where I'm also using font size and font weight to create information hierarchy. So the title of the mission being the most bold, the text at the very top being like its own personal identity, but again, kind of tangential. This is just the stage that you're on. And then the body copy being thinner, much more deprioritized. And as you can see, I'm creating clear areas here and also across the game to create consistency for where to look for the main content of the screen header in the upper left, the persistent access widgets for notifications, settings, and profile in the upper right, and input prompts at the bottom. And after lots of polish, the final result is a more refined version of the mockup with some modifications to the layout, such as bringing the content area down to accommodate the scroll indicator input prompt. So you can see above the times. And I also wanted to de-emphasize the times of day. So those were in the previous mockup a little bit bigger than the mission titles, which actually wasn't really helping anybody. So now they're equivalent, but more distant from the center of the screen, so they are de-emphasized. I'm also using information grouping by using proximity and alignment to imply a relationship between the content within the mission item, as well as the item slot to the mission item. I'm sorry, the time slot to the mission item. So you can see that 7 a.m. corresponds to set one first show ever because of the way that they're aligned. I'm also creating a distinction between information that's desired passively and is therefore critical to making a decision about your next actions, which are the title of the mission and your current score in stars, and information that's needed if the item turns out to be important, so you hover over it and you get more details about gameplay from that mission and the rewards if you do well. But You don't want all of that all at once. This is something that would be distracting, so put that under the fold. I'm also using a monochromatic effect on the locked items to create contrast with the colorful unlocked items so that those appear distinctly inaccessible, and replacing the details with a lock icon. And also to note, these locked items don't react to hover. So if you move your mouse over those, you will not get the hover effect. The next thing I'm going to go over is sort of a shallow dive on the Social Hub Mixed Discovery tab. The question that, or the problem that I needed to solve was how do we revise the Social Hub to better recommend mixes to players now that we can recommend more of them and with more metadata filters? Again, for context, this was the original shipped Social Hub. This is what we actually had the ability to do at the time. We didn't have that many mixes we could recommend at once, and because there were so few, it shared a space with the activity feed for other players that are your friends. But it's not terribly cohesive. It's sort of a catch-all for things that we really wanted each to have its own space. So now that we actually could, we gave mixes their own space, which meant redesigning the layout of the mixes as well as potentially other tabs. And that was going to be the case because no matter what, we needed to move the activity feed somewhere. It was also an opportunity to better define sections of the screen. So the header in blue, the tabs in green, filtering in purple, content in orange, and input prompts in gray. And again, this was also a chance to align all of the tabs on the Social Hub to the content area from tab to tab so that they remain consistent on screen, and to partition mixed recommendation and discovery from player search and activity. And this was the final result of that. There's not actually too much to add here because it did really just sort of come together exactly the way it was. But this is sort of what happens when you have a feature that already exists, that you've seen it proven out several times before, in fact. And so for it to just come together in a different arrangement, it was proven out as functional, so we didn't really need to prove out a lot more functionality. We just needed to prove out, you know, see more as a way to get to additional recommendations, and just to make sure that all of those things loaded in properly. It's a lot of net calls, so some additional things going on, but mostly the visuals had been proven out. And I just wanted to say, as I'm wrapping this up, I think all disciplines benefit from thinking about and using principles needed for UI and UX. Thinking about user-centric criteria to determine success is something that is, I think, very important to think first about the user. Of course, I will be saying that I'm biased, but I think it's important to consider the user first and what the user wants to do. The player wants to have fun. The player wants to enjoy, surprise, and be delighted. So try to give those things to them, including in your interface. Um, Consistency in presentation sets expectations about what they can expect from across your game from the minute they start till the minute they end. If things continue to do what they say on the tin that they're going to do because you have created visual language that indicates that that's going to be the case, then that's fantastic. You're not surprising them with things that could be very upsetting if it turns out that you don't meet their expectations. The contextual delivery of information changes reception. So how you give that information, in what density do you give that information, how much are you asking players to memorize or commit to memory at any given time, how do you form relationships to other things on the screen. Those all influence how those things are received from what you are giving them. So be considerate of how you do that, because something that could be great with one change turns out that it's not received terribly well, in a way where you just dumped all sorts of information on them at once. And similarly, have an information hierarchy. It matters that you are the one who's sort of in a way rationing data that you're giving them, but it's important to do that. Some of that information is not important to players. It shouldn't be player facing. Some of it is important to the development process and building screens and being in design, being an artist, being an engineer, but the minute that that information needs to go out to players, it should be questioned. Does it actually need to? Um, and if it does, some data isn't as critical as others. And it's on us to not overwhelm players with equally weighted and exhaustive information. And ultimately, the goal is to create an enjoyable, intuitive user interface that looks and feels good. So, thanks very much. If you have any questions, I would love to have them.